no doubt the source of many jokes.
I'm sorry to
so we shall see.
jinx it.
But my name is Anna Iltis. I direct the Center for Bioethics, Health, and Society at Wake Forest, and I know many of you through class and other activities. Thank you for being here. Thank you for joining us today. It is really my pleasure to introduce Dr. Maureen Kelley to you, and I'm thrilled that she will be talking to us today about climate justice and health. Dr. Kelley is the Wallace and Mona Wu Chair in Bioethics and Professor of Internal Medicine at Wake Forest University School of Medicine and Director of Bioethics and Chair of the Atrium Health Wake Forest Baptist Medical Center Clinical Ethics Committee. She completed her doctoral training in philosophy at Rice University and clinical ethics training at Baylor College of Medicine in Houston, Texas. Before joining Wake Forest, Dr. Kelley has held faculty appointments at the University of Oxford, Oregon Health Sciences University, and the University of Washington. From 2014 to 2022, she held a professorship and led a research program in global health and bioethics at the Ethox Center and in population health at the University of Oxford. Dr. Kelley has collaborated internationally with numerous partners in global health, and currently she is on a project funded through the Greenwall Foundation in collaboration with Dr. Mariah Merritt at Johns Hopkins University, who is also a Wake Forest University alum, exploring how community science partnerships can serve as a tool for climate justice. So thank you so much, Dr. Kelley, for joining us, and welcome.
Thanks. So I am so sorry about the heat. I promise I did not plan this. Hopefully you'll be uncomfortable after this talk for other reasons than the temperature in here. It's really a pleasure to be here, Anna. Thank you so much for the warm welcome, literally. And it's just fantastic to have a chance to come over to main campus. Most of the day I'm over at the hospital, and I chair the clinical ethics committee, so do a lot in clinical ethics. But on the research side, I do a lot of work in global health and have for many years. And for the past 5 or 6 years have gotten involved in climate justice. So that's what I'll be talking to you about today. Just by show of hands, how many of you are students? Yes. How many of you have taken any environmental sciences courses or climate science? A few of you. How many of you have taken bioethics courses? Okay, great. So you can ask the person next to you if you have a question about the other area. It looks like there's a little bit of overlap. I'll try to keep some things high level, and then I'll dig into detail in a few places, but I'll leave time for questions. And if you've got a burning question while we're in the middle of it, don't be shy, and go ahead and raise your hand and I can talk through it. So what I'd like to do is put these two ideas together. So a lot of you are aware of climate change. I'll set the stage for that, but won't get into a lot of the details. I'll sort of assume that you're aware of the situation. But what I want to do is link it to health, because I think there still is not a lot of awareness about the severe health impacts that have been happening for the last decade in communities that are already hugely affected by climate change and that will affect all of us before too long. So I want to put those two together. And then the other combination I want to offer is that this is an issue of justice, that it isn't just an issue of preparation, of understanding what the consequences might be, but it's a very deep issue of justice. So that's what we're going to do today. I'll walk you through those sort of three ideas and try to put them together by the end. So this photo that you see on the back, let me thank people first. People always thank people last and then you don't get to it. So I want to thank people first. As Anna mentioned, I've been working with Mariah Merritt, who's at the Berman Institute for Bioethics at Johns Hopkins, and then a team at Oxford, and then Wessal Khan and Jill Black in South Africa at Stellenbosch University. Wessal is really interesting. She's a water biologist, and she works in the surrounding communities in Cape Town and has partnered with a lot of community activists around climate change and how it's affecting water shortages in Cape Town. So we've been working together on a project looking at how we can improve science and community partnerships for climate change activism. And then two of our students who are at Johns Hopkins, Hannah Markle and Stephanie Peralta, were also involved in this work. And our sponsors, as Anna mentioned, Greenwall Foundation, and also the Wellcome Trust sponsors one of our grants. So that photo I've been flashing up is, does anybody know where this is? Anybody recognize it or guess? Guess Alaska is one guess. Antarctica? Closer. It's Patagonia. So this is the famous Gray Glacier on the Chilean side of Patagonia. And to help you with scale, the photos that are in the background here, our boat is right in front of the face of the glacier. So when we shift here, you get a sense of just the sheer volume of this glacier. Now, I took this photo when I was there with my sister in 2016, and since 2016, this glacier has receded by roughly 100 meters a year. So about 8 football fields, it has retreated back beyond that ridge that you see there, that back ridge, in just 8 years. And what's astonishing and frightening about this particular example, because I know you see lots of examples in the news of Greenland and other places, this is one of the most protected places on the planet. Torres del Paine is a really remarkable preserve in Chile. And the entire region is a protected area, and species protection, conservation of the trees and the flora and fauna. But that this would happen there shows you that this is inescapable, that warming's inescapable, right? So we can try to protect certain areas, we can try to protect certain regions, but ultimately nobody can and nowhere can escape climate change, and particularly global warming. So let's look at the impacts on health, because I think a lot of you are probably aware through the news of what's happening to our climate and potentially why, but a lot of people don't appreciate the links to health. So I'm going to walk you through some examples. So what kinds of things does climate change cause? So we've already seen in our own neck of the woods really unpredictable weather, huge storms. So this includes both floods on the one side and droughts on the other. Increased pollution, and again, these are all man-made causes or human-made causes, and then extreme heat. And this is one example where those who are affected by it, in this case, workers who work outside, are extremely susceptible to heat stroke, to other issues. Most of the data show that heart attacks are actually the lead cause of heat-related death for men. And so those who are working outdoors, those who are exposed are a particular danger, but basically a large number of vulnerable populations are susceptible to heat-related injuries. You also see deaths from exposure to children, to those who basically are vulnerable otherwise. So any baseline health issues and vulnerabilities that we have, serious heat will exacerbate those. The other really significant overlap between climate change and health and significant impact, and this is something we're working on in partnership with infectious disease scientists, is the impact and drive of increased infectious diseases globally. And this includes in our own backyard. I have a lot of global examples, but this is true here as well. So vector-borne diseases. Does anybody know what vector-borne diseases are? Well, who's the vector? Usually.
No. Well,
Any guesses?
bacteria.
I saw someone do this. Yes.
Ticks.
Ticks. What else? Mosquitoes and ticks are the two big culprits, right? But also different kinds of flies, like tsetse fly. So vector-borne diseases, if you think about, this is a laundry list of just a few of those. And again, some of them are here. So malaria, dengue, not so much, but we see West Nile virus and a lot of the tick-borne diseases. So there are a number of projects in the southwest, for example, that are seeing the scientists are mapping a huge proliferation of the tick's geography. So because winter isn't coming and destroying the life cycle of the tick, they basically get to reproduce all year round in places where their population was controlled. So if you think of the diseases that are transmitted by ticks, by mosquitoes, by other flying insects, all of those are increased precisely because the vector has a happier environment. Now, it's not always the case, right? So if you have drought, it's going to control the waterborne insects a bit more, and so we can actually see a dip in malaria in some places. So it's nuanced, but overall, we're seeing an increase in vector-borne infectious diseases. The other significant impact is through diseases like cholera, so waterborne diseases. So every time you see on the news the raging floods, that tends to go hand in hand, as it has historically, with waterborne illnesses. And again, those affected most would be kids playing in the water, playing in the street, those who don't have adequate housing, etc. And then there are a number of other bacterial diseases that can expand their range due to climate change and temperature change. And again, due to the erratic weather. So it's not just the temperature, it's also increase in flooding and other extreme weather events. The other is malnutrition, and this might not be completely intuitive. So the impact of malnutrition is largely attributable to those two weather events, so to flooding and destruction of crops due to floods, and then droughts, obviously, is what you may have heard about more. So food insecurity really rises with these events. And with the rising heat, it particularly affects small holdings, right? So yes, it will affect massive, corporate agriculture, but the folks who are really affected will be the small farm that depends on one harvest, and if a flood comes and destroys their land, that's their income for a year. So the impact for small landholders, which is basically those living on the margins or those who are living a subsistence living, is really severe. I also wanted to call out pregnancy and under 5 morbidity and mortality. So the impact on women's pregnancies, on childbirth, and on young children is really significant, and almost double that of the adult population. So for pregnancy, what we've already seen, and there's already data to show, we've seen an increase because of the droughts, because of malnutrition. We've seen that translate into lower birth weight pregnancies, which can be linked to preterm birth and a lot of risks for the mom. So things like high blood pressure during childbirth, called preeclampsia, and other events are much more common due to the underlying stress on the mom's body during pregnancy. And again, these are things that we have gotten a significant grip on and seen vast improvements on through development work, through global health work over the last decade. So it's really upsetting to see us backtrack because of climate change. And it's difficult to sort of keep up with the interventions that have now been tried and tested over the last 8 years or so. The other thing is that to mention is that with under 5 morbidity and mortality, children really are the ones who don't have a voice in this debate, right? So one thing to keep in the back of your minds is who's here at the table whenever we have a climate change political discussion. Those who don't have a voice in the political discussion are the ones on these lists. They're the ones that are most affected, and yet they don't have representation. So I'll talk a bit more about our obligations to children, our obligations to future generations, but this is what I have in mind when I mention that. So the other hidden area that we're just starting to learn more about, and we started to look at this in this country after Katrina, is mental health. So again, the impact of these weather events aren't just the event itself. What happened after Katrina, those of you who were, I always have to remind myself how old you would have been. After a large storm, what are some of the, what tends to happen to people? Yes?
Be displaced or their moms.
Exactly. So displacement. So a lot of the stress, the anxiety, the mental health impact is coming from displacement. It's coming from losing your home. It's coming from having to, in some cases internationally, having to leave your country. For example, the small island nations where you have to actually leave your nation, leave your home, leave your homeland, not just your house. And there are strong links between anxiety and rising heat as well. So even outside of these sort of dramatic weather events, there's documented evidence that depression, anxiety is linked to higher temperatures. And again, you'll see greater susceptibility for those who are older, those who are younger, those who are already malnourished, right, already stressed in terms of their health. the other thing that we don't often think about is there's a ripple effect for health workers. So we were working on a project for a long time, about 8 years in Kalifi, and like clockwork, every single year there was a cycle of extreme drought and then extreme flooding. And it affected the diseases that we were seeing coming into the clinic and into the hospital. But what else did it affect? The healthcare workers. They live in the community. Their kids live in the community. They were getting sick or were exposed to illness, exposed to more malaria than they were typically having to take prophylaxis, enduring the side effects. They were losing their homes to flood or drought. We had a nursing strike during that time because of the stresses of trying to make ends meet on a small nursing salary in Kenya when you've lost your home or you've lost your plot of land where your partner could bring in some additional income for the family. So health workers are also impacted. They are from these communities and live in these communities. This was a study that was done in Australia looking at, they've basically had a decades-long drought, and they tracked the spike and increase of sustained spike and increase, not just episodic, of anxiety, depression, and suicidal ideation among those that had endured the drought. And it particularly struck those that lived in rural populations. So those that don't have the same social support, that aren't in an urban setting with a lot of folks helping one another, those that are separated from their neighbors were harder hit by the mental health effects. Last, I think it's really important to call out all of these health effects disproportionately affect indigenous communities. If you think about where original peoples have been relocated to, they tend to be undesirable geographies. They're on land that floods, they're on land that is coastal and isn't meant to, on landfill that isn't meant to be built on, they're on land that doesn't have sufficient water. And so you have this sort of double injury, in a way, a moral injury for indigenous communities who are dealing with the health effects of climate change, not just the other effects of climate change, but in particular the health effects. So the areas that are really affected in North America, for example, the Arctic Circle, Alaska, a lot of those communities are having to retreat further and further back and physically pick up and move their homes because of the encroaching waters and with rising sea levels. We also see a huge impact in Australia, New Zealand, Pacific Islanders, and there are a number of examples. This is one here where probably this entire island community will have to relocate either to mainland New Zealand or elsewhere. And this is not a minor thing. This is a way of life. This is their land. While they it may not have been their original place, it's still, this is their home, this is their land, this is where their neighbors are. And immigrant life in Australia and New Zealand is not a pleasant one. Historically, it's not much better than here. So it's important to keep in mind who's impacted by some of these health effects. So I think I've probably answered this implicitly, but I want to draw this out and make this implicit because it's really important. Why are climate impacts an issue of justice? So it could just be an awful thing that's happening to our world, but why exactly is it something that concerns ethics or justice? I'm going to focus on justice. Does anybody want to say? Or take a pass at it? Yes.
Because certain groups of people are affected disproportionately by it.
Yes, thank you. I haven't planted her in the audience. Thank you. Yes. That's part of it. So when the work of justice, in particular distributive justice, I won't get into their discussions around whether reparative, restorative justice might be relevant here, but I'm going to focus on distributive justice. This is just that very simple idea that we're concerned about who's carrying the burdens on their shoulder and who has access to benefits, and are those equally weighted, right? Is somebody bearing more of the burdens? So when you think about, there's a project called the Global Burden of Disease. It's been really powerful in global health. It's an epidemiological project that has mapped all of the diseases that we can possibly map for different age groups, for different populations, rates and severity over time since the 1990s. And it's been a powerful tool of social justice. Why? I mean, it's giving us more accurate counts of disease, but why would it be an important tool for social justice to have that mapping? Yes?
You can see the disproportionate effects for certain communities. If you're able to actually map where it's happening, then you can see the populations that are most.
Exactly. So it puts in stark relief that some have a greater burden than others. And it does it for under 5 mortality, for death and morbidity and pregnancy and childbirth, for TB, for HIV. And it's been a really powerful tool, not just for combating disease, but for showing where are the pockets of inequity in global health. So the same sort of thing is going on with the health impacts of climate change. We want to know who is shouldering the health burdens that I mentioned, the other socioeconomic burdens, dislocation, etc., job loss. And as Simon Caney has described it, there are 2 kinds of burdens in climate change. So one is mitigation burdens. Who is responsible and has to pay for dealing with putting up the berms to respond to and prevent the next flood around your town, building new bridges when they get washed away, right? Who is going to try to look at solutions and pay for those solutions? That's one type of burden. And then the other is adaptation burden. So when you're just trying to find fixes that are a bit more temporary, right? You're not trying to solve the upstream problems, but you've got to figure out how to adapt. And that would include moving your community, that would include rebuilding, that would include other sort of adaptations. Both of those cost something. Both of those take energy and time away from your community's resources, right? And so that's why they're burdens. And if those are distributed inequitably, then that's a question and a concern for justice. So climate justice in particular, we've already had a couple of people point this out. It is disproportionately affecting those who are living in poverty. It's disproportionately affecting indigenous persons, peoples, and communities. And yet, when you look at the drivers are historically and currently industrialized nations. To drive this home, here's one of those maps. Okay, so A is looking at the carbon dioxide emissions by country. So if you just look at A, who are the big polluters looking at A? Us. Yeah, who else?
Sure, like China.
Europe, China, global north would be a safe bet. Now in B, what we're looking at there was this group of scientists mapped, they had to pick a few outcomes and link them to climate events. But they picked malaria, malnutrition, diarrhea, and drownings because those are some of the top burdens or health impacts of climate change. And lo and behold, this is where those climate-driven events happened. What's the difference between the 2 maps? Who was mostly affected?
Global South?
Mostly the global south, defined as lower income or lower and middle income countries, because see India, we've got India, parts of Southeast Asia, right? So this is exactly that sort of example, quite a powerful example of why this is an issue for justice and disproportionate benefits and burdens. So you not only have, with the global burden of disease, you have, it looks like B when you look at most diseases, but you don't have the same relationship between A and B where you say, well, all those diseases are being caused by folks in the global north. You don't quite have that, right? You have lack of infrastructure, poverty, and other things driving the global burden of disease. So what's unique, I think, or distinctive about this data is that you have a perpetrator in a way, at least regionally, that shows some causation or at least attributing factors for the suffering of others. Mary Robinson, who is the former Prime Minister of Ireland and was very involved in the UN around climate change, put it really well. She said, we're talking about those who had done least to cause the problem carrying the greatest burden. So it has this notion of responsibility embedded in it. So if we think about climate change not just as an awful thing that's happening to all of us, but as a question of distributive justice, how should we think about responsibility? What kinds of questions and considerations should we take into account? And I'm going to offer you a frame for how we ought to ask questions. We don't have time to delve into, how should we think about responsibility, but I want to give you a frame for the kinds of questions we ought to be asking and how it shifts our thinking. So it shifts our thinking in 3 ways. It forces us to think globally, whether we want to or not. Again, climate change through a justice lens. It forces us to think about interspecies obligations and relationships. We can't just think about humans, we have to think about animals and the ecosystem. It forces us to think intergenerationally. So I'm going to dig into each one of those, but these are the 3, and they're empirical and normative. What I mean by that is we have to think that way to understand what's happening, and we have to think about in that way to figure out what we ought to do and what we owe each other and what we owe future children, etc. So it's both a descriptive shift in thinking and a normative shift in thinking, a kind of ethical shift in thinking. So first is global. Hopefully, this was a map from the pandemic. One of the things that sort of crashed on our head during the pandemic is we are not separate from one another. If that wasn't already clear, the pandemic made it really clear that borders, diseases don't respect borders. And we saw what that meant. And this is another one of those maps where we have rates of COVID-19. This was in 2021. But you see that even high, and in fact, in the first year and a half, you saw a disproportionate impact on high-income countries because of travel, because of our laws, and some of the political controversies around quarantine and that sort of thing. There were a number of reasons, and people are still trying to sort out why exactly we saw that flip from the previous map we saw. But the point of this global map is to just show we are not immune from these kinds of events, right? They will happen, and it will happen again. And climate change is one of those things. It's something that political borders are largely irrelevant when it comes to the actual harms and effects that are happening. The second shift in thinking that climate change through a justice lens requires us to do and to sort of stretch is to think about what our obligations are to our future offspring, if you have children, or just the future generations, right? We tend to be pretty myopic in thinking about ourselves, maybe thinking about our immediate family and friends, but especially when you're younger, we often, it takes a lot for us to get outside of our head and think about a future generation. There was a wonderful story that Mary Robinson talks about when she had her first grandchild, and she went to the hospital and she held her grandchild, and she said she just took this intake of breath and suddenly her view expanded, and she started thinking in terms of the next 100 years. And she talks about that moment as being pivotal in her interest, not just interest, but passion in tackling climate change. And she shifted her political energies in that direction because of how having a grandchild affected her. This was a father and son in a project we're working on in Thailand. And you have the father teaching the son how to fish. And increasingly, the fathers are having to teach the sons what to do when the fish, the water's too warm for the fish, and where are the pockets, and how do you sail more dangerous waters to access the shifting fishery resources in that particular place where it's been a long-standing livelihood. This is my dad and my niece and my sister when my niece was born, and my dad, had that same reaction. Both he and mom suddenly started talking about the future in a way that they never had before, and caring about the kind of world that they're leaving for my niece. And so there's there are events like this that can shift us. You don't have to go have a child, but it represents something. It taps into our common humanity. It stretches our sense of caring into the future, and so it can be quite a powerful thing. But there are lots of other ways that you can try to imagine your connection to others, and I'll give you some suggestions in a minute. The last is it requires us to consider interspecies interdependence. And this is interesting because, so from a long-standing Buddhist perspective, and you'll see this in Buddhist environmentalism, we have to overcome our self-centeredness, not just between us and others globally, not just between me and my future human beings or relatives, but me and other species on the planet that need a healthy ecosystem, that ought not suffer, that ought to have places to roam, and all the other things that we hear about in the animal rights movement. The obligations to non-human animals in the climate change context is mainly around their own suffering, the health of their habitats, the health of ecosystems. And this is linked to the first shift in thinking, which is that we're interconnected. So you can't, ecologists have known this for decades, and they have always thought holistically. If you speak to an ecologist or you read a paper on ecology from the 1960s or 70s, it's imbued with this holistic thinking because that's what ecology is looking at. It's looking at the web of life. Outside of ecology, I think particularly in the health sciences, we don't think a whole lot about the web of life. We think about the patella, or we think about, the ventricle, or one of the ventricles. We might think about the whole heart, but we're not great at thinking about how that person, their health fits into an ecosystem. So what follows from these shifts? So if you can make those three shifts, Henry Shue, who's written on climate justice, his point of view is that it's no longer a question of what we prefer to do. This is just something I'm not that interested in. I don't have a lot of time. I have other things I want to spend my energy on. And Shue says once those three shifts happen, and once you really appreciate the impact that's happening now, not just in the future, and the vulnerability of others, that we're called to action. Not just non-action, but to action. That when you're faced with somebody who's vulnerable, you have this, and you're in a position to help, you have this obligation to do something, to act, to get involved. And so the analogy at the institutional level, political level, would be that as industrialized nations, we have an obligation to act, an obligation to do something for those who are vulnerable or in developing country settings. Now, I want to critique this a little bit because it's an interesting idea. I certainly think obligations follow from making these shifts, but I worry a little bit about stopping with this idea that others in those communities are vulnerable and that we have to rescue. I think that would be not the way to understand this. So I'll say a little bit more about that. So there are two problems with thinking about our obligations in the context of climate change, our obligations to other future generations, animals, as one of vulnerability, the vulnerable, and the assister, the rescuer, if it's not obvious by my language. One is intersectionality, which I'll explain in one sec, and the other is the agency of those who are deemed vulnerable, who are at risk. So all the people on map B that I showed you. So the first, the idea that it's intersectional, this is just a practical issue, but a very, very hard practical issue, and that is you're not vulnerable in one way, right? You are vulnerable because you're a child, because you are a Kenyan child, because you are a Kenyan child who doesn't have adequate household income, because your particular ethnicity is not the one in political power. These are layers, what Florencia Luna, the philosopher, has called layered vulnerabilities. So they can act and interact with one another, layer upon layer, and exacerbate one another. So this just means we can't think about vulnerability to the effects of climate change. We have to also pay attention to the other layers for a community or for people. All that means is it's harder to figure out what our obligations are. Should we go after poverty in a particular community, or should we focus on the impact of high waters, flooding, et cetera? And the answer is you have to do all of it, no differently than we do in the global health context. So we've sort of modeled this and a project on the Thai-Myanmar border. And the other piece of this that we found in working together with healthcare workers, community health workers, and a group of women who basically staff a series of 4 to 5 clinics along the Thai-Myanmar border, former Burma, and offer basic health services, treatment for malaria, TB, dengue, and safe childbirth. And that's it. That's all they focus on, and they do so quite effectively. And this is a very remote jungle region, very inaccessible. And one of the things that, in working with them and trying to understand how do you target health interventions, because the model is we'll go after malaria, we'll focus on malaria prophylaxis. When the picture looks like this for the people living on the borders. So most of them are immigrants from Myanmar, and if you watch the news, very difficult time in Myanmar, dangerous. During the war, a lot of that is spilling over the borders. And so they're politically very vulnerable. If they're Burmese, they're politically extremely vulnerable because they're not the politically represented group. And they've been ousted from their villages in many cases. They may be on the run. On top of that, they have the health, social, economic vulnerabilities. So these are the layers I meant and that I made reference to. And this is how they sort of cycle and connect to one another. But the other thing that we notice is what's on this blue line. And this is what a lot of people overlook, including really well-meaning healthcare teams, UN agency, other NGOs and sort of services working in the area. And that is that everyone we met, everybody we talked to, everyone we involved in workshops had ideas about how to fix things, had ideas about what was causing the spike in TB or drug-resistant TB. And if you stop to listen and involve the community members, they were not only willing but hungry to be active agents of change in their own communities. And if we take that simplistic vulnerability framing, we lose that completely, and you don't see those who are highly susceptible, highly at risk for diseases that are being exacerbated by climate change, but they also have great ideas. They have local indigenous knowledge. They know which plants you can go pick if you don't have quinine or you don't have malaria prophylaxis. They have really heightened awareness about the seasons and about where the flooding's happening and what's been happening over the last few years. They can map out the climate change impact in great detail if only the scientists who are working in those areas would pay attention and listen. So that's what I wanted to get at by pointing out these two blind spots and just thinking about our obligations based on vulnerability. We need to be thinking about those who live in these places, and it's us part of the time as well. So we're talking about Louisiana and Alabama and Mississippi and our coastal communities. And we're talking about our Alaskan indigenous communities, our Pacific Northwest and Southwest indigenous communities. So I'm going to introduce some moral ideas that I think do a better job than sort of Western ethics of thinking about how to think about our obligations to one another in response to climate change. So this idea came out of the project I just mentioned. So in Burmese the word is anar, and in Thai it's krangjai. And we spent 2 years trying to tease out how that translates into English, and I think I lost count, but it was 100 words in English to 1 word in Burmese to try to figure out the nuances. It's translated in context, it depends on the social context, but these were some of the high points of concepts that you'll recognize in your own sort of, I think, moral compass. The first is a really deep sense of reciprocity, that if somebody gives you something, there's a very deep sense of both gratitude and I then need to do something in return. And it's not instrumental, it's not sort of shallow, it's a very deep sense of we are connected by this gift that you gave me, or this favor that you did, or you helped me during a storm, or you walked my mom from the flooded river on your back, and now I deeply have this connection to you, and when I have an opportunity, I will do something for you in return, but it's not transactional. I don't think I'm explaining it very well. It's we're connected and bonded because of that goodness of heart that somebody showed and that someone else is showing gratitude toward, and it connects us forever. And so you have these very deep connections between community members who have undergone repeated hardships, and they have these very deep bonds of reciprocity, gratitude, and connection to one another. The other idea in our NAR that's really powerful is selflessness, that you put others before you, that you think about, if you hear this a lot about a lot of places around the world, but it's really, really true along the Myanmar border. A family could have absolutely nothing left in their cupboards, and if you come along as an outsider, or even as a neighbor, they will pull together the most beautiful meal from somewhere, and they will kill their last chicken for you, and they will take the last mango off the tree, and they will make you a beautiful meal, and it would be absolutely wrong to turn it down. It's a gift, and it's showing you hospitality in a very deep sense. So there's this sense of selflessness, of always trying to do for others before you do for yourself, including deep self-sacrifice. And it runs deeply in the culture. It manifests in all kinds of ways, not just in hospitality. The last two are mindfulness and humility. So in mindfulness, so there's a strong Buddhist tradition in this part of the world. There are a number of different religions, so it's not unique to Buddhism, but being still, listening to the birds in the morning, even hard workers who are holding down several jobs will pause certain times of day, at sunrise, at sunset, during prayer, and just appreciate who they're with, what's happening around them, what they're seeing that's beautiful. And that awareness can be quite a powerful connection to the environment, to nature, to what's happening around you. And humility is pervasive. So you really would have to drag it out of someone to find out that they're actually an elder in the community. They will not tell you. You have to learn from somebody else that this is the person who really is the leader in our village. Because everyone presents to you with humility. You don't, again, this is about not putting yourself at the center of attention, of seeing yourself, even those who have attained a lot, they see themselves as having attained that precisely because so many others either sacrifice for them, put themselves behind so that they could be pushed forward for an opportunity, especially parents and grandparents. And so they don't see it as a personal achievement. It is a strong sense of humility. The second powerful idea that I think can help us think through our obligations in a time of climate change is from my colleague Cesar Artui, who is Ghanaian and just moved to Oxford and is living in the UK and sending me emails about how cold it is. So not today. So Cesar tapped into a very ancient way of thinking in Ghanaian philosophy and morality about our connections, and it's called empathic humanism. And the idea is, again, that as human beings, we have to harmonize with one another by the very nature of the connections, interconnections between us. And this idea is grounded in seeing the other as part of you and vice versa, that we're not different, we're not distinctive. There's a famous image that I think does a better job of explaining this, and I just did. It's called the Adinkra symbol, and these are two crocodiles, but they have one stomach. So they're twisting and turning, and sometimes they're fighting. They don't necessarily have their interests aligned, but because they share a stomach, they deeply depend on one another. And they sometimes nonsensically will fight over food, and then it dawns on them, well, wait a second, it's going to the same place. We've got to figure this out and settle our differences. So as Cesar explains it, the pejorative sense in which this gets used is it's about sort of human idiocy, that we don't realize that we deeply depend on one another, that we share the same stomach, and yet we self-defeatingly fight over things that if we were to work together, we would be much better off. But Caesar adds this additional layer, which is that humans positively have a common interest, and if we stop the bickering, realize the connectedness, we can actually work well together to pursue a common goal. So he's added this, I think, additional constructive idea to the concept. So thinking of those ideas, because I think they're quite powerful ways of thinking about how we're connected to one another, how we're connected to future generation, how we're connected to other species. What can we do in healthcare, right? What do you, I mean, if you look at anybody on our staff, they're incredibly busy. They don't have time. How could we possibly ask that they do more than what they're already doing in that line of work or in the professions of healthcare? So there's a low bar, which is that modern healthcare is one of the biggest contributors to pollution. So just trying to figure out how to clean up our act in hospitals and looking at the amount of waste that we put out, so pollution into the air, into our water. You'd be surprised and I think horrified at what comes out of hospitals. And the other thing is that the health sectors in developing countries, I think, struggle with this even more because they lack that infrastructure for sanitation, for recycling, etc. This is an image from India during the pandemic, and we saw this in New York, we saw this in the UK. This was not just an issue in developing health systems. An enormous amount of waste. We were focused on trying to kick a pandemic, so the last thing we were thinking about was like we couldn't recycle what we had. We needed enough protective garments, and we weren't thinking about where they were going to go after one use. So that was an extraordinary circumstance. But on the average day, you see an extraordinary amount of waste coming out of hospitals. The other thing a lot of people don't realize is what gets released into the air by hospitals. So a lot of harmful toxins, including dioxins and furans. There was a study that looked at inhaled anesthetics, anesthesia, causes a significant sort of output of carbon dioxide in the surrounding environment and surrounding air of the hospital, whereas intravenous doesn't. So that shift to intravenous over oxygen or anesthesia by mouth can make a significant difference. Again, this is an issue that's even more hard pressed in developing health systems, but it's one that we face every day. So there are people who are working on this. There are a lot of projects in the works. There are NGOs that just look at and come in and advise in hospital on how to recycle. Something as simple as a mask or as an EpiPen. It turns out if you have parts that are plastic paper mix and they're stuck on there and you can't take them apart, you can't recycle the whole thing. So little things like that, if you can make an EpiPen that comes apart, where you can take the needle off, take the plastic off, take the paper off, you can then recycle those materials. So there are folks working on that, and if you're interested, there are a lot of interesting projects you could get involved in. The other thing that the scientific community is doing is shouting from the rooftops in the way that scientists do. Joining together, publishing papers, commentaries, getting involved in politics, getting involved in WHO and other sort of major reports. And you'll see a proliferation of journals in climate change from our top journals. So there's now a Lancet Planetary Health, there's a Nature Climate Change. There are a number of special issues. So Lancet Countdown on climate change and health and climate change. Why are these important? Go back to what I said about epidemiology as a tool of social justice. Every data set that gets published in the pages of Lancet in JAMA is basically saying you can't look away from this, right? You're staring it in the face. It's very powerful. So not having it nested in a normal issue of JAMA means that it's being called out as a significant problem, and we're being given and presented the data to actually figure out what will work, where the problems are, how big they are, and what will help to fix it. Social science is also doing its side of the work. Johnny Miller is a social scientist who uses aerial drone photography to uncover and raise awareness around health disparities and climate change, looking at the contrast between verdant or green neighborhoods and impoverished neighborhoods. They almost always track. They look like this. You have density on the one side, you have green landscape and parks, etc., in the wealthy neighborhoods. So it was a really powerful project because, again, you couldn't look away. And almost every major urban center in the world had this structure of those that had a better, healthier ecosystem environment, access to outdoors and parks, were higher income neighborhoods, cities, regions, countries. And those that didn't looked like the city on the left. We've worked on a project to try to increase funding and partnerships around infectious disease, and a number of things are being done to harness, going back to what I said about the importance of community activists and really harnessing community knowledge, scientific knowledge, through community science partnerships. So this is the group on the Thai-Myanmar border, and Supak Nostan leads the community health workers on a number of different projects, but in this particular one, they were working on malaria elimination. So looking for pots that needed to be overturned that were holding water and other factors in people's homes that would increase the likelihood of mosquitoes. And the idea that's come out of this, we did a landscape of all the projects like this where you had science community partnerships. And what they all had in common was that the community members were driving the science. The community members were saying to the scientists, let's go show you, this is where we think the problem is. Here's where we think ticks are worse. Here's where we think mosquitoes are worse and why. And they were treated as what some call citizen science, right? So they're being brought into the science, they're helping to shape it. And it's a really exciting model to think about. I mentioned Jill Black's work in South Africa and West El Khan. They did a project around in the communities around how water was being stored to try to, during the drought, to figure out how we can address vector-borne diseases and also waterborne infections. And this is an example of one of the community gatherings. They made films and videos which were then shared with Minister of Health. And so one of the things that's come out of them, and this was a really powerful comment, was that sense of empowerment vis-a-vis politicians. So they're used to being, having politicians turn a blind eye. And this person said, I felt I was a victim until now. I feel we are being part of a change. So that collective action that's been made possible through partnerships with universities and scientists who have the ear of the Minister of Health in a way in which community members sadly don't always, has been a really powerful model for change. This was another example that Supak led around melioidosis during when the rice fields are flooded and they need to plant. A lot of people are working barefoot and get exposed to, again, infections in the water. Seems simple, it's very focused, but it's been quite a powerful community-led project and effort. So I want to leave you with one other thought, in addition to the ones on Anar and Cesar's idea of kind of the interconnected nature. And this is another one out of the African continent, because it's really cross-cutting across most of Africa. Almost every community has a slightly different word for the same thing. In Kenya, it's Utu. In South Africa, Uganda, and a few other countries, it's Ubuntu. You may have heard of Ubuntu. And the idea is, I am, the literal translation in Xhosa is I am because we are, or I am because you are. So it's that idea of, I wouldn't be here if it weren't for you. We are connected to one another. We depend on one another in a deep way. It emphasizes our solidarity, our dependency on one another, the ways in which we can lean on one another. And in Swahili, Utu, it's translated as shared humanity. So again, it's a bond that we share no matter where we come from as human beings, and it's I think a very powerful idea. And if you want to, I think the slides will be shared, and you can go to this link. And Desmond Tutu has a wonderful discussion of Ubuntu and why it's so important and needed during this time. So the last thing I urge you to do, I'm a dabbling, very, very amateur landscape photographer, is just to look around. The cherry blossoms right now are a great example of just taking a pause and being reminded of just how remarkable and in awe we ought to be of, nature around us. This is a stand of redwoods at our family's house, and they survived the fires in Northern California. And my godparents and all the neighbors were out during the fire trying to save the stand of trees, because they had a photo of when they were married in front of the trees. They had a photo of family members who had just had a baby in front of the trees. These trees represented connection for our family. And they're a bit singed and burned, but they're still standing. So thank you.
Thank you so much. We have a couple of minutes for questions, and then we invite you to join us in the much more comfortable room next door for a reception, and you can continue talking with Dr. Kelley and with each other. So, would you like to just field your own?
Yeah, sure. I'm sorry for the heat. This really does bring it home, I hope. Any questions, comments? Yes.
I was just wondering if you think that framing this crisis in terms of justice helps in a political and legal sphere versus just the scientific, the push of scientific side. Because I've been hearing more about climate justice recently.
I would hope so. I think it's a way of thinking about what kinds of arguments should we be taking to politicians, and you increasingly will see reference to climate justice, and Mary Robinson was a great example, in UN reports, in WHO reports. They're imbued with ethical or social justice language. And that's not new to climate change. So I gave you the example of the global burden of disease. If you go to any meeting on HIV, for example, or on TB, malaria, those kind of big global infectious diseases, you'll have a section on ethics at those meetings, but you'll also have scientific presentations where the discussion or the implicit assumption is a kind of ethical assumption, or an assumption that this is unjust or this is inequitable. Health equity is another one that has not just crept into both scientific discourse, but also when the science is brought to politics. It's done very technically now. So there's very technical, precise work that's being done on how to address health equities that didn't used to be the case. So it's more than words. It's actual empirical work that's being done, like how do we close the gaps when we introduce a new intervention. So yes, but I think it requires those of us that work in healthcare or do research to take that extra step to participate in those meetings, or to make sure that our papers get in the hands of those who are politicians or are sitting on advisory groups. Easier said than done, again, when you're very busy or when you just don't speak the language or you're not part of that club. They don't always want us at those meetings. But I think that's changing. I think a lot of panels will invite people who work in health and social justice to be part of the reports and part of the write-up. So I do think that's shifting. Anybody else? Are you all just melting? Yeah. You want to go get cool?
But please do join me again in thanking Dr. Kelley for being with us. And please do join us next door. I promise it's much more comfortable over there. So thank you.
You know, it's like that. Yeah.